Hi, Susan here. Okay, what is seam allowance? I'm going to talk all about what is seam allowance and the difference between seam allowance in commercial sewing patterns versus industry standard manufacturing and designing, and the seam allowance that's necessary in certain areas of the pattern and the design, and all of that's next. Why am I doing this video? Well, I just did a video on the pattern notcher for fashion design and industrial type sewing, and I asked you if you wanted me to couple that with the seam allowance video, and you said yes. So here it is. And so watch both of them and it'll make a lot of sense, guys. So seam allowance is that extra from the seam line, which is here, to the cut edge of the pattern or garment piece, which gives you the allowance in order to sew two or more pieces together of a pattern or design. Because if you cut right on the seam line and sew right on the seam line, you will have frayed little edges. You will be smaller than the ideal size that you were hoping to have. So this allowance is that extra that is needed in order to sew the garment pieces together. And so there's also commercial sewing patterns that you can pick up anywhere versus industry type manufacturing and sewing. And so commercial type sewing patterns usually have the 3/8 of an inch to 5/8 of an inch all the way around the pattern. It's pretty consistent, it's pretty widespread. And industry type sewing and manufacturing and designing is much different. It's much less. It's usually 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch, and some places maybe 1.5 inches. Why is that, guys? Why is it so different? The main reason for that is that in commercial sewing patterns, you can adjust them, and it makes it easier for beginners or advanced people to sew that actual pattern. But when you're working industry standard and your industrial type patterns or manufacturing and designing, waste is a no-no. So any extra that can be trimmed off of a pattern in the cutting process as well as in the sewing process, any extra steps that can be eliminated by having the seam allowance less in certain areas rather than clipping and notching and taking off fabric is essential. So industrial type sewing uses a very tight ship and a smaller seam allowance margin than your commercial sewing patterns. So I'm going to talk industrial type sewing patterns primarily on this video and what is needed in the certain areas of the pattern. If you're getting my PDF downloadable slopers, which I want to put a plug for, that I have on my website, it's going to come without seam allowance. So a lot of patterns, guys, are these PDFs now. You're going to have to add the seam allowance on your own. Please watch those videos to show you how to make that pattern and to add the seam allowance. I'm going to talk with my sloper set is any kind of side seam. This is a back pattern piece, and this is a front pattern piece. Any side of the pattern, the top or shoulder of a pattern, the waistline of a pattern, and the armhole of a pattern are usually a 1/2 of an inch seam allowance most of the time. There will be some differences if fabric warrants it, meaning if the fabric frays a lot and you want to add more, or if the fabric is very, very sheer and you want to add less, or you want to eliminate some of that seam, or if it's bulky fabric and you are going to have to do a special seam, you're going to want more than your typical or your standard 1/2 of an inch on the seam allowance of those areas. Skirts are the same way. The waistlines of the skirts where darts are, side seams of the skirts will also be a 1/2 of an inch. 1/2 of an inch here on the sleeve cap, 1/2 of an inch on the sides of the sleeve. Let's say you're going to be making a sloper for yourself, or you're trying to fit a garment and you want to have an opening in the front. You can add that 1/2 of an inch seam allowance on the front, or on the back pattern piece, you might want to add the 1-inch seam allowance on the back piece in order to do a fitting of any kind. And this goes for couture or one-of-a-kind. They play by different rules, guys. They add a larger seam allowance on most areas because they do not mind the time-consuming elements of trimming back as things are necessary. And in industrial type patterns, you will have notches to indicate those areas, and that will be your only guide to know how much seam allowance is on that cut garment. Let's say you have a large dart. We're doing this front bodice and I have this large dart. If you have any kind of sheer or lightweight fabric, folding that dart and all that excess that will be in the back will also possibly show through the garment itself. So on large pattern pieces such as this, it is necessary to cut out all that excess and just give yourself that 1/2 inch seam allowance to sew it and maybe marrow in the back, or even do a French seam if possible. Necklines, design lines, sometimes even collars are all a 1/4 inch seam allowance around those curves. Pants are the same way. This is a back pant sloper. This is a front pant sloper. You want to add a 1/2 inch at the waistline, a 1/2 inch in the crotch area, a 1/2 inch in the inseam, and a 1/2 inch on the side seam of a pant. The only exception might be in the fly area if you're putting a different type of zipper and you need an extension. Then there are hemlines. As you can see here on this torso sloper piece, where there'll be a notch that indicates where it's folded up or where it is hemmed. And that allowance, as you can see here, can be anywhere from 3/4 inch to 1 1/4 inches. Most hems and most standard hems are 1 1/4 inch. In certain other areas, you'll see 2 to 2 1/4 inch turning up. Collar pieces such as this, as you're sewing into the collar area, which I will show you the garment of, that will be a 1/2 inch because that makes it easier for it to be lined and catch all the layers. Edges of the collar, edges of a design line are always a 1/4 inch. So you can see here, with the collar edge, you don't see any excess, you don't see anything there. It is just cleanly done, and it's easier to get those notches, it's easiest to get those curves and straight edges if you have just a 1/4 inch seam allowance in those areas. You can also have a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, but if you have a lined garment, it is sometimes necessary and easier to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance in those areas to be able to catch and turn the lining properly. The cuffs of a jacket or the excess that is usually done can be anywhere from 1 1/2 inch, as I have here, to 2 inches, depending on how much structure you want on that. So guys, it is not only the standard measurements that I'm giving you right now, but it'll depend on the fabrication. Those will be the only exceptions to the standard measurements that are pretty much across the board. So in industry type fashion design and sewing, it's either a 1/4 inch, a 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch, or 1 inch for fitting purposes or excess in certain areas. Hems 1 1/4 to 2 1/4 most of the time, and that is your standard measurements. I hope this video helped. Give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. I have a huge array of videos on fashion design, and I would love to hear from you. Let me know what you want to see next in this area, if I should continue on these simple videos touching and going in depth in certain areas. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.